on behalf of the Freedom Project, the Departments of Sociology and Economics. It's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Daniel Markovits, Guido Calabresi Professor of Law at Yale Law School and founding director of the Yale Law School Center for the Study of Private Law. Professor Markovits is the author of the widely discussed 2019 book, The Meritocracy Trap: How America's Foundational Myth Feeds Inequality, Dismantles the Middle Class, and Devours the Elite. As its title suggests, this book lays out an original argument about the costs of the American meritocratic system and how they are borne across many different groups in our society. According to Professor Markovits' analysis, at the center of meritocracy lies a dilemma, even a rot, one that not only creates winners and losers, but that punishes all who enter into its game. Markovits' brilliant study, supported by a deep and wide survey of the data about American inequality, has prompted a discussion that has spanned journals both liberal and conservative, from the Wall Street Journal to The Nation, from the New York Times to the New Republic. I'm also very excited and happy to introduce my colleague in the Wellesley College Sociology Department, Professor Kelly Rutherford, who will be moderating this afternoon's conversation. Kelly teaches courses in sociology on social class and inequality, on sociological theory, on consumer culture, and on children in society. She is the author of the fascinating study, Adult Supervision Required: Private Freedom and Public Constraints for Parents and Children. Her focus in this book and in other work on the limits of autonomy, on the roots of inequality, on the persistence of class divisions, and on conflicts between the state and individuals and how all of these work themselves out in educational settings, makes her the ideal interlocutor for today's conversation. I'm really grateful to her for her willingness to come out on a Friday afternoon, and to all of you in the audience for being here as well. So thank you and welcome. And Ann Valenchik, Dean Ann Valenchik, will do the introduction for Professor Loury.
Thanks, Cappy. I was asked to introduce Professor Loury because we know each other. So let me explain how that is, because it'll give you some information about him that you might not be able to get from Google. Professor Loury's late wife, Linda Datcher Loury, and my husband taught together in the economics department at Tufts. And Tufts, like many academic departments, has these parties to which spouses are invited to attend. Those of you who have spouses will not disagree with me when I say that your spouse's work parties are not everyone's favorite social engagement. And until Glenn and I figured out that we could politely decline to attend, we would often find ourselves in a corner with our plates of potluck food, engaging in wide-ranging conversation on a number of topics. He's a well-known economist. He can talk about just about anything. So I think we'll get to find that out together. Glenn is the Merton P. Stolz Professor of the Social Sciences and Professor of Economics at Brown University. Prior to that, he was University Professor and Director of the Institute on Race and Social Division at BU, and prior to that, he held faculty positions at the Kennedy School, in the Economics Department at Harvard, at Michigan, and at Northwestern. And all of those are things you could find out if you Googled him. If you Google him, you will also find an enormous amount of information about Glenn as a public intellectual, as someone who has been in the forefront of a wide-ranging debate, among other things, about the role of affirmative action in shaping America's future. But there are some things about him that you might not necessarily find out on Google, and that's what I wanted to say now. Glenn Loury is a formidable economic theorist who brings to bear the very best of what economic theory asks you to do: to be mathematically rigorous and elegant, to be parsimonious in your modeling, and to have an eye for what does or does not constitute an interesting problem. And in all of those ways, Glenn made early in his career important contributions to a number of fields: to labor economics, to industrial organization, to the theory of taxation, to our understanding of how underdeveloped credit markets and rotating credit societies influence economic outcomes. What I wanted to say about Glenn is that he actually probably didn't have to choose the path he chose to be on here. That is, he could have had a brilliant academic career in any one of those fields, none of which would necessarily have engaged him in public debate on the role of race in determining economic outcomes in our society. And I would argue that the choice that he made was a risky one, and I'm arguing that from personal experience. When I went to graduate school a decade after he did, the one thing they told female economics graduate students was, do not work on gender issues, because no one will take you seriously if all you want to write about is yourself. I can only imagine what a decade earlier people were saying to a black graduate student in the program at MIT. And I think it speaks a lot to Glenn's belief in the power of scholarship to influence the world, that he chose the path he was on. That path has sometimes brought him into direct conflict with all kinds of people, conflicts that he has handled, in my mind, with the same kind of intellectual integrity that I am sure he's going to bring to the conversation today. It has been a pleasure for me for 25 years to get to debate with Glenn, and I think it's going to be fun to hear him do it now.
Great.
Thank you both for being here. I've enjoyed getting acquainted with your work, and I'm looking forward to a very stimulating conversation with you both. In my own recent research on the experiences of families whose children attend high-performing high schools, I've heard a lot about a growing concern that what can be referred to as an education arms race creates crushing pressures on students and their families to succeed in a competition that families are perceiving as growing more and more competitive. So families are perceiving the competition, especially to get into elite colleges and universities, as ever more competitive. And while the families that I'm talking to, their teens are arguably better positioned to succeed than many teens in America, a growing number of them are talking about looking for some kind of an off-ramp, some way to grasp a more expansive definition of success. They certainly want economic security and they want to have fulfilling careers, but they don't necessarily want to have to be the top achiever in order to aim at that goal. And so it's clear that these individual families and even their local communities are grappling with how they can respond to the structural situation that they're in, a structural situation of rising inequality, a kind of winner-takes-all economy, dominated especially by the graduates of elite universities who go on to be top earners. So I was very excited to see that in his book, The Meritocracy Trap, Daniel Markovits addresses this very structural situation, critiquing the growth of meritocratic inequality in America over the past couple of generations. Whereas many critics of growing inequality see meritocracy as a potential solution to inequality, maybe an ideal that hasn't yet been realized but could, Markovits takes a different approach, explaining rising inequality as the direct result of meritocracy's inner logic. As he puts it in his introduction, the central tragedy of the age reflects meritocracy's triumph. Meritocracy, not by betraying its ideals, but rather by realizing them, imposes a caste order that equality's champions should condemn. And combating inequality requires resisting the meritocratic ideal itself. So Daniel, it seems to me a natural starting point for you to explain, perhaps for those in the audience who haven't read your book, what you mean by meritocracy, and perhaps more importantly, what you do not mean by meritocracy, and how you see that exemplified in our current situation.
Great, thank you. Thanks very much for that. Thank you for being here. Pleasure to be here with you also, Glenn. So to answer the question directly, a meritocracy arises when people's advantage, their income, their status, their social position, depends on their accomplishments rather than on their parents' social class, their gender, their race, or any number of other irrelevant, as it were, categories. Now, that means that meritocracy is distinct from two other ideas. And maybe one way to get into this is just to announce those ideas and explain why meritocracy departs from them. First of all, meritocracy is advancement based on accomplishment, not advancement based on native talent or virtue. And the reason why those can depart is that talents are trainable, virtues are acquirable. And education works so that if people have different opportunities to receive training, similarly, natively able people will accomplish different amounts. And one thing that's happened over the course of American meritocracy is that an old, largely aristocratic elite, the mid-century American elite, which was basically a birthright elite, and lacked both the capacity and the taste for educating its children distinctively, has been replaced by a new meritocratic elite, which became elite precisely by absorbing and then performing enormous amounts of training. And that elite has an extraordinary taste for and an enormous capacity for educating its children, and invests immense amounts of skill, time, and especially money in educating its children, so that the gap between the education that rich kids from professional families in America receive today and middle-class kids, not poor kids, but middle-class kids, has become absolutely enormous. And maybe at some point we'll talk a little bit about how to measure that gap or how to think about that gap. But one thing that means is that because rich kids get educated in the ways in which middle-class and poor kids don't, when people advance based on their accomplishments, rich kids advance much, much more than middle-class kids and poor kids. Here's some illustrative facts that just drive that home. The gap between the average SAT score in the United States of a child whose parents are in the top 4% of the income distribution and a child of a middle-class median income household today is about 250 points, which is about twice as big as the gap between the middle-class kid on average and the average SAT score of a child born into a family below the poverty line. The rich-poor gaps are even bigger, of course. Just as an illustrative statistic, the College Board puts out data on college-bound seniors each year. In 2016, if you ask the question, how many kids were there, at least one of whose parents had a graduate or professional degree, whose SAT verbal score was at the Ivy League median? The answer is in the United States about 15,000. Now ask how many kids reached the Ivy League median SAT verbal score, neither of whose parents had graduated high school, and the answer is that the distribution becomes so thin at this tail that accurate inference is unreliable, but if you just do the sums, it's 32. Now, that means it's not surprising that institutions that admit students based on their academic accomplishment skew dramatically to wealth. And as probably many of you know, today in the Ivy Plus colleges in America, there are more kids whose parents are in the top 1% of the income distribution than in the entire bottom half. And those kinds of facts, which again I hope we can return to, investigate, characterize, they lead me to conclude the answer to the question with one other distinction. Meritocracy is not equality of opportunity. And the reason why, again, is if meritocracy is advancement based on accomplishment, and accomplishment responds to education and training, and rich people buy more education and training than anybody else, then precisely meritocracy's successes will produce dramatic inequalities of opportunity. And that's one of the basic themes of the book.
Thank you. I really appreciate that distinction between accomplishment based on training versus accomplishment based on talent or effort. And I think a lot of Americans take the word meritocracy to refer to some kind of a somewhat natural distribution of talent and or effort. And I think one of the reasons that many Americans have embraced this idea of meritocracy as they understand it is their belief that if it can be properly achieved, if it constitutes some kind of equality of opportunity, as people want it to. That meritocracy holds the promise to overcome many of our past systems of privilege, including those rooted in race and ethnicity. Glenn, you've written a lot about the challenges facing us as we seek to ensure access to America's meritocratic institutions by Black and Hispanic Americans especially, most notably access to elite colleges and universities. I hope you can talk a little bit about the implications that these well-established patterns of racial inequality we're facing have for our discussion of meritocracy today.
Okay, I'm happy to do that. I want to first ask Daniel a question. Can
Sure,
I do that?
yeah.
Because I'll confess I haven't read your book, and that's much to my loss. I can see that needs to be remedied. But the question is, because what it reminds me of is this old argument I associate with James Fishkin, what does he call it, justice, equal opportunity in the family, something like that. Here's the point. The point is there's a dilemma or a trilemma, he argues, and this seems to me to be very much in the spirit of what you're saying. You can't have all three of these things at the same time. You can't have autonomy of the family, meritocratic allocation of positions, and equal opportunity. You can't have all three of those things at the same time, because if you've got autonomy of the family, you've got a private sphere of human development where there are different resources that are going in depending on the capacities and accomplishments and the economic position of the parents. So families are unequally positioned. So human development, other things equal, is going to be different across those families. Then if you allocate positions based upon people's capacities to perform, which will have been developed as a consequence of their gestation within these private spheres, you're going to allocate those positions to some degree reflecting the different opportunities that people had to develop their human talents. So this strikes me as a deep problem. I mean, what is going to give here? Either you're going to not any longer allocate positions to people based upon their capacities to perform, or you're going to abrogate the presumed autonomy of a private sphere of human association within which families differentially treat their young people, or you're going to abandon the ideal that you're going to have some kind of equality of opportunity. And I'm not sure how one gets around that dilemma. So anyway, I just put that on the table. You've asked me about race and racial inequality. So can't we take this point, and perhaps you do, one step further? Not only are some parents college graduates with professional careers and obsessive devotion to the improvement in education of their children, some groups of people who associate with each other through networks of affiliation are differentially endowed with a history of wealth, of professional access, of who can you invite to dinner that can tell your kid about what it means to be a physicist or a geneticist or whatever. And because groups are differentially situated from history, we're going to end up perpetuating, to the extent that we allocate rewards based upon performance, we're going to end up with different performance across these groups on average because of the history, and so we're going to end up allocating things differently. And that strikes me as also a deep problem. The history can't be undone. One can try to mitigate the effects of that history through various kinds of compensatory efforts of one sort or another, like affirmative action for admissions to selective educational institutions, or like investment in the development, extra educational investment from early childhood on in the development of the youngsters who are from more disadvantaged groups as well as from more disadvantaged families. One can do that. But it strikes me on the evidence that that's only going to be partially effective at closing the gap between these things. And inevitably, there's going to be a kind of trade-off. There are benefits in conditioning admission, let's say, to a selective program of study based upon people's performance, which performance will reflect their social position, to be sure, but nevertheless, it is their performance. If I'm trying to teach a technically demanding curriculum in the STEM fields or in the quantitative social sciences or in law or whatever it might be, that enterprise is enhanced by selecting the participants into it based on their capacity to perform certain kinds of intellectual work. That's the nature of the beast that we're talking about here. So equality isn't the only good. I guess that's my bottom line on this. Equality isn't the only thing that we should be concerned about. Efficiency is also an important objective. And I think the proof of the pudding here is going to be in what is proposed to do about the unequal consequences of the different life chances that are affected by the fact that not all parents are equally well equipped and and intensely devoted to the development of their children. It seems to me that you could do a lot of leveling interventions that aim to prevent a child from benefiting from the fact that their parents have been successful. Leveling interventions like insisting that everyone have the same educational development by, in effect, overriding the parents' autonomy with respect to raising their own children are extremely intrusive and destructive of liberty, of the freedom of people to live as they would choose. And leveling enterprises at the stage of admitting people to specialized programs of study, from undergraduate education on through to the training in the professions and so on, could also be costly in the sense that society doesn't get to benefit from these right tail events of people who are exceptionally talented, who, because they got obsessive parents investing in their development from day one, have turned out at the age of 25 years old to be exceptionally talented and productive human beings. They have something to offer to society that we wouldn't want to sacrifice necessarily on the altar of equalizing life chances across these households. So, I mean, those are some thoughts I have in reaction.
It makes me wonder, though, in the pursuit of goals like efficiency or optimizing individual performance and recruiting trained talent, how we can avoid lapsing into what Eduardo Bonilla Silva calls abstract liberalism as a frame of colorblind racism. How do we balance those two goals? Because as you said, it's not that equality is the only goal, that there may be other goals as well, but they have to be positioned against one another, and we have to think about the interplay between them. Not sure who that's a question for, but.
You want to say something, or shall I?
No, you go ahead.
So yeah, on sort of connecting these two themes, on the question specifically of race in the U.S. now, there's a kind of dilemma also at play here, which is picked up by this question of abstract liberalism, which is that the appeal of meritocracy with respect to racial hierarchy is that because humanity and native talent are not distributed differently across races, meritocracy is an excellent cure for what might be called categorical exclusion or subordination. It's a great principle for explaining why, in principle, everyone is equal and has an equal entitlement based on some sort of neutral evaluation of their performance to advance. At the same time, because, Glenn, as you say, resources, financial network resources, sociological resources needed to promote the accomplishment of children are unequally distributed by races, the principle that is a bulwark against categorical exclusion can become an engine of empirical exclusion, because the categorical effect can be weaker than the empirical effect of differential opportunities to invest. So that, for example, a study by, I think, Carnevale and Stroll out of Georgetown recently said, if, for example, college admissions were based exclusively on the SAT, college students in this country would be richer and whiter. Now, there's an obvious explanation for that, which is that it's rich and therefore disproportionately white families who can invest in the most teachable part of the meritocratic enterprise. So that's the first observation I want to make. There's this tension. Second point, this question about the autonomy of the family, I think, is really profound. And we may reach the sticking point on it. So it may turn out that to achieve the kind of equality we want, we have to interfere in spheres of life, domestic spheres of life, family relations, that we think are appropriately sacrosanct. But there are a lot of things we can do before that.
Such as?
So for example, we may need to find ways to prevent rich parents from structuring their children's education as they wish. The city of Berlin, Germany, has enacted a statute that makes it effectively illegal for daycares to devote more than 90 euros per month in excess of the state subvention per pupil to their children, to their students, so that gold-plated daycare is illegal in Berlin. Whereas in Boston, it's easy for rich families to spend $25,000 a year on their 3-year-old's daycare. So this is a way in which the state intervenes in domestic family choices to prevent families from using their wealth to buy preschool education for their kids. But notice, in our society at this moment, we're nowhere near that sticking point. So here's a striking fact.
No, many people would like to have access to bronze-plated
That's right.
daycare.
But even more strongly than that. So the richest university per student in America is Princeton. Okay, Princeton educates more students from the top 1% of the distribution than from the bottom 60%, not just the bottom half. That's how rich Princeton's student body is. Princeton is organized as a not-for-profit institution. That means that its endowment grows tax-free to Princeton, and it means that alumni can give donations tax-deductible to the alumni. The value of that public subsidy, that's a public subsidy for Princeton students, someone recently calculated is $100,000 per student per year. The state of New Jersey's public subsidy for the middle-class students who go to the State University at Rutgers is about $12,500 a year. And the state of New Jersey's public subsidy for the largely working-class students who go to Essex County Community College is about $2,500 a year. So the 1%ers at Princeton get a public subsidy 40 times bigger than the working-class kids at Essex County Community College. And that we could undo through a variety of mechanisms without inserting ourselves into the family in any destructive way. So that's the second. Let me say one third thing, which is the most radical thing in my view, and I just want to get it out on the table so that it can be discussed, maybe objected to, maybe not. It is true that when people advance based on their accomplishments, a certain kind of efficiency is produced. But I think we have to be really, really careful before we ascribe too great efficiency advantages to inequality and meritocratic inequality in particular. And there are various abstract ways I can put the point, but let me make it very concretely with respect to a business I know well, which is law. So in the United States, we have an incredibly meritocratic, incredibly unequal form of legal education. Yale Law School is the #1 ranked law school in the country. Almost everybody who is admitted gets in. We devote many, many, many more dollars per student than any other law school to training our students. Our graduates go out into the workplace. They're all guaranteed $200,000 a year jobs. If they stay at their law firms, they're going to make $4 or $5 million a year as partners. If you go to the most profitable law firm in America, which is Wachtell Lipton, it has profits per partner in excess of $5 million a year. 86% of its partners attended top 5 law schools. Now, why is that? The reason why is that our technology of legal production has a very peculiar feature. The value to a client of having a lawyer and of having a more skilled lawyer is enormous all the way up the skill distribution. If you're in litigation and you have David Boies, that's worth a lot compared to just an average elite law partner. And if you have an average elite partner, that's worth a lot compared to a not very good lawyer. And that's true because of technical features of how we run trials. It's because we have technical arcane rules. It's because the parties are in control of the facts. It's because judges can't investigate. It's because there's relatively little equity. There's a lot of law. In Germany, in the civilian tradition, none of those things is true of a trial. The parties don't control the facts. The judges do. There are relatively few technical rules. Judges can reach sensible decisions based on their own judgment, not under the control of abstract doctrine. Once a German lawyer is competent, she will do everything for her client that can be done, and the additional value of a super lawyer is almost zero. At the same time, Germany has no elite law schools. It has a large number of good law schools and absolutely no elite ones. So what we have in the US is a highly hierarchical meritocratic legal education system and a highly hierarchical work production system. Whereas in Germany, we have a relatively egalitarian education system, a relatively egalitarian work production system. And here's the kicker. No comparative lawyer I have ever met thinks that the American system of litigation is more efficient than the German one. The German one is more efficient. And it's more efficient precisely in virtue of its relative equality. Now, my claim is actually that that pattern generalizes across finance, across management, even across medicine, that there are lots and lots of sectors of the economy in which relatively less hierarchical forms of production are relatively more efficient. And if that's true, then the tension that you identify, while real in some cases, is less pervasive than we might fear it otherwise would be.
Well, I haven't thought this through fully, but it occurs to me that there's some questions that one would want to ask. I get the point. So I've got a sphere of production, and it has its own technology, what we economists would call technology, where you get outputs from inputs, right. How it's organized. I've got a sphere of preparation, developing people to participate in the sphere of production, and it has its own structure. And to the extent that I've got winner take all or high returns to small differences in performance in the production sector, that induces a kind of heavy emphasis on, I assume American judges who have to look for clerks are also very peculiar about who they hire.
Completely. I
would bet Yale and Harvard and Stanford are way ahead of the University of Illinois, or Cornell, or whatever, even though those are probably perfectly reasonable law schools. So I get that point. I was sitting here asking myself, should we be advocating for a German system of organizing jurisprudence and dispute resolution? Is that feasible given our history? What are the different histories of these different societies that have led to the evolution of these practices and so forth? I assume there's some issue of guilds and people protecting their turf and rents that are being skimmed off by people who don't want to see those rents go away. So I'm in the mood of thinking, how would we change what we're doing in the U.S. in light of the observation? And I'm not sure what the answer is, although I'm intrigued by that. Medicine is another thing. Everybody wants to have the best doc, right? I mean, I assume surgeons who are very highly ranked and have their agendas crowded with people who want to be their patients are able to take more out of the till. The human impulse to have the best doc, right? I mean, that's a cultural thing, right? We're asking, I've got a problem, who are you seeing? Well, you ought to see so-and-so at Mass General. I mean, I've actually literally been told this by people. Don't just go to a doctor. You have to go to this doctor. You got to go to the best doctor. We're going to drill out of people the impulse to want to do that. I think in other areas, like in entertainment, I assume the distribution of rents amongst people who produce video streaming or music services or who perform in opera or on Broadway stages, when I assume that the people that you really want, the billable actor that's going to draw, those people are probably getting a much higher return on their work than others. So what am I saying? I'm saying I'm put in mind of another piece of research. This is Sherwin Rosen, Economic of Superstars. You must know this paper, where he observes that depending upon how easy it is for the top performers to garner a large share of the market to themselves, which is basically a technological issue, if an opera singer can only be heard in person, then you got a 2,000 person auditorium, and that's the limit on how much a performance is going to be heard, so that market is small. But if high fidelity reproduction of the audio is available for people to put a CD into a changer and hear something that's almost as good as being in the auditorium, now this opera singer can serve an audience of 20 million people, and people might be willing to pay to hear the very best opera singer rather than to go and hear the third or the fifth best. Same thing with tennis players, same thing with basketball players, same thing perhaps with people who write code very well or who are very productive in the tech fields or whatever. So listening to Daniel, it sounds like he's describing a normative problem, an ethical problem. Would that we were organized differently in this society, equality would have a better chance of being achieved. I want to take a little bit more cautious approach to trying to draw conclusions about intervention, because I'm not sure about how, I don't want to kill the goose that's laying the golden egg. I don't want to, interrupt a complex production chain that is producing inequality, but that is also allocating people in the most efficient way. I'm repeating myself. I want efficiency as well as equality, and I think there's sometimes.
I think your medicine example, though, too, illustrates the idea that perhaps we're not producing in the most efficient way, because our medical system is highly inefficient. Although it's really good for those who can afford the top doctor, but costs a great deal compared to other countries, and is distributed in wildly unequal ways, and doesn't really produce better outcomes. In fact, we have some of, in some ways, really shameful outcomes for our medical system.
Yeah, can I pursue that thought just for a moment? So, in connection with a piece of informal economic reasoning that I wonder what you think of. So the Economics of Superstars story is one in which a certain technology, namely a technology that expands the scale of a market, increases the returns to small additional increments of skill at the very top of the distribution. There are going to be other technologies that also do that. So the law technology is actually a different technology. It's not that it expands the scope of the market, it's rather that it's technology that allows certain kinds of creativity, one case at a time, to yield returns. This is important in litigation. It's incredibly important in deal making. So incredibly super skilled lawyers created by their innovation the US market for corporate control by creating the legal techniques that enabled outsiders to oust incumbent managers and take over corporations. And that's also a kind of innovation. But here's the critical thing about that kind of innovation. That innovation shows that the relationship between hierarchy in education and hierarchy in the labor force involves two-way causation, not just one-way causation. So the way you imagined it is once you get hierarchy in the labor force, there's an arms race in education. But what I'm also saying is that once you get hierarchy in education, interested innovators who are responding to the existence of these super skilled workers change the technology of production to favor precisely the skills that the super skilled workers have. And in the case of the market for corporate control in the US, that's exactly what happened, actually. A bunch of super skilled lawyers innovated in such a way as to increase the economic value of lawyerly super skills. Now, I think the same thing can be shown in management, in finance, in a whole range of fields. That matters a lot for our opportunities for social reform. And it also should lead us to be a little skeptical about this close correlation between efficiency and high measures of inequality. And the healthcare story tells that too. Just one brief observation about that before I stop. Think about our healthcare system, which is incredibly expensive and produces worse population health. That's connected to the technologies of production that we use. So we have large numbers of super skilled, for example, heart transplantation surgeons in our society that a small number of disproportionately rich people can use to get well when their heart suffers in various ways. Here's something we don't know the answer to. We don't know whether it's better for your heart health to have intense exercise for 3 hours 1 day a week, moderate exercise for 1 hour 3 days a week, or to walk to school and work every day. We don't know the answer to that question. And we certainly don't know, if we did know the answer to that question, how to modify behavior at scale in order to induce people to do whatever is best for their heart health. We don't know the answer to that question because we have not done the research and innovation needed in order to answer that question. And one reason why we haven't done the research and innovation needed in order to answer that question is that we have produced a large number of extremely highly trained medical specialists who have drawn innovative energy to themselves to produce the innovations that enable them to transplant a few people's hearts. If we had the public health knowledge and the behavior modification knowledge, this would be much better for our heart health as a population than the ability to fix a few things using super skilled workers ex post.
Yeah, I object, however. I mean, I'm nitpicking here, really, because I don't object, basically, to, there could be a lot of low-hanging fruit. I mean, I think that's the bottom line on this. We might, scan the horizon and find many different practices that are subject to modification and that would both give you more efficiency and more equality. I take that point. What I'm objecting to is not being certain what trickle-down technological benefits might follow from some of these kinds of specialization that are driven by people's desire to have the best heart surgeon or whatever. I just don't know, because it's not an isolated activity, and it's going to have knock-on effects of one kind or another. But that's a minor point.
If I can push us along and change the subject a little bit, turn direction a little bit, because you've both mentioned the idea of reform, which is, what can we do? And this event was advertised on campus as part of our #Wellesley Votes initiative, which is a nonpartisan initiative aimed at bringing together the Wellesley community to explore our shared commitment to democracy and democratic values, and to help students develop skills for lifelong active citizenship. So I'm hoping we can kind of shift gears a little bit, and if you can talk some about the implications of meritocracy and its discontents for our collective understanding of and participation in a democratic society.
Well, I was about to say, having just observed the democratic primary process.
Well, that was my follow-up question.
And the thought was, would that we had more effective meritocratic selection of the people who participate in governing us. Can we import a little bit more inequality so that the average IQ, forgive me.
Or just reward training and talent, accomplishment.
Okay, it's a snarky comment, I withdraw.
No, go ahead.
You want to say more, or shall I?
No, you go ahead.
So I have two thoughts about that, in particular with respect to the connection to democracy. So we were talking earlier about the way in which meritocracy blocks equality of opportunity, and that's a kind of structural block. So here's one way to think about it. The way in which old aristocrats pass their privilege down to their children is just by dying, and then the children inherited the lands and the titles. So let's ask what the equivalent meritocratic inheritance to that aristocratic inheritance is, and we'll do the following thought experiment. Imagine you take the difference between what a typical 1% household spends on educating its children each year of the child's life, and what a typical middle-class household devotes to educating its children. And imagine if each year of the kid's life you put that difference into the S&P 500 to give to the child as an inheritance on the death of the parents. Right, so that's the equivalent of what the old aristocrats did. That sum would be more than $10 million per child. So that's the form of structural dynastic succession that our society produces through meritocratic means. But here's the connection to democracy. At the same time as meritocracy creates this massive structural exclusion of middle and working class people, it also creates an ideology which characterizes each individual middle-class person's failure to get into the elite as a private personal inadequacy, as a failure to measure up. So it injures people by excluding them structurally from training and advantage, and then it insults people by telling them the reason you're excluded is not structural, it's your own fault. It's your own problem. Now, that insult naturally produces extreme resentment and anger. And one way in which to understand the populist upwellings and the venom directed against both elites and even more marginalized others in our society is as the natural product of people's being told it's your own fault that you are being structurally excluded from advantage. So that's one way in which this kind of inequality is particularly politically toxic. I have other things I want to say, but let me pause for a moment.
You have thoughts about maybe...
Well, first of all, I can't believe the $10 million number. Could that be the present value, the difference between what a rich and a middle-class family spends on the education of their kids? Because $10 million is a lot of money. A 3% annual return on $10 million would be $300,000 a year, which can't possibly be the monetary value.
After the return.
No, it goes the other way. What I'm imagining is instead of investing it in the education, this money gets put into a fund which is given to the child on the death of the parents.
And you're saying that fund's going to be $10
That
million?
fund's going to be, in fact, that fund under really realistic assumptions is going to be about $16 million. And I mean, I have a table in the book that explains how I get to those numbers.
So I mean, but think about that for a minute, because what that means is implicitly the parents are paying in the effect of a bequest that's $10 or $16 million smaller than it otherwise would be, in order to be able to brag about their kid going brown.
And in order for
No,
their
not
kid
just to brag, though, but to create the opportunities that they know their child is going to need to be successful in this economy and this job market.
and the social status. And here's the other point about it. Aristocratic inheritances actually undermine the next generation's ability to continue the dynasty. You know, you get the Paris Hilton story, shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, because the aristocrat is a wastrel. But this form of investment doesn't just give you earning power and social status. It also gives you the character trait, which means you're going to do this to your child and pass the privilege down again and again and again.
Okay, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. Let me take the point. The point, as I understand it, is that the capital market for human capital development, human capital loans, people's investment in their skill, education, and training is imperfect. There's a malallocation of those resources across families, and wealthy families are investing way more, given the ability of their kid, than poor families are doing. And we could do better as a society if we were to shift some of that investment in the other direction. And indeed, everybody could be made better off in the sense that instead of the wealthy parent intensely investing in the education of their kid as a way of trying to further their kids' prospects, they could, in effect, loan that money to poor families who could invest it in their children's development, and the return on that would be higher than the return of that last dollar invested in a wealthy kid's, wealthy family's kid. That's at least part of what I'm understanding to be the case here, and let's stipulate that. What about, I'm thinking about some other things, because it's not only financial resources that wealthy parents are endowed with that allow their children to do better, it's also cultural resources. Nobody is insulting anybody to observe that somebody took me to the opera. Nobody took you to the opera, and I know what opera is. Somebody said to me that this is calculus when I was 13 years old. Nobody told you that. Now I know what calculus is. Or what about genetic endowment? Not about groups. Don't start rioting. But individuals. Somebody's smarter than somebody else. Their kids are on average smarter. We know that that's just a fact about the way that human societies are organized, or at least about the way human beings are. We do pass on certain traits across generations within families that are valuable in terms of how people do in life. Or don't we? Are you denying that? Is it necessary to deny that in order to make the argument that you're making work? Because if so, how do I compensate for that? I can tell a parent, you can't invest more than X times what the median family is investing in your preschool. I can tell them that. But I can't tell them, you can't decide to mate up with each other in such a way as to reinforce your natural gifts and then pass them on to your children.
So I'm happy to jump in if you want, or do you want to?
Well, let me ask one other question, because you mentioned human capital, and I think this question of what can we, how do we think about the role of families in this really intersects with a particular interest of mine. You've described this meritocratic inequality that we have as hinging on human capital rather than kind of physical capital or the landed capital of the old aristocrats, right? And that has to be rebuilt in each generation, and this is why this intensive focus on education. But I want you to address some of the ways that rebuilding human capital requires an added burden for women. Women, we know, make up a little over half of the students at Ivy League colleges and universities, but men are significantly overrepresented among the top earners that you describe as having those glossy jobs. And some of what's happening is the way that we organize gender roles and family roles and how that intersects with the world of work and accomplishment.
So I think that these two questions actually connect in a certain way. Especially on the training side. You know, Cal Ripken Sr., who was Cal Ripken Jr.'s father, the baseball player, once said, "Practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect." And that's absolutely true. That is to say, in order to succeed at educating people or getting educated, you don't just need money. You need human capacities. And you need human capacities in addition to just your own effort and practice. Your effort and practice needs to be directed in an effective way by people who know how to direct it. And that's the reason why, one of the main reasons why elite families are able to transmit their accomplishment, their privilege down through their generations. Now notice, I've said all of that without mentioning genetics at all. For what it's worth, my belief is that the sorting that we are getting does not have a genetic component. There's evidence in favor of that. The correlation, for example, between parents and children's IQs has not gone up in the past 50 years. Another, I think, very powerful thought, which I think comes back down to Samuelson actually first realized this, is that the distribution of genetic endowments is going to be have a fairly compressed support. It's not going to have a thin tail at the high end. But the distribution of income and wealth has an incredibly thin tail at the high end. And what that means is if you want to account for the distribution of income and wealth, you're going to have to account for it in terms of something that is more extremely unequal than the distribution of genetic endowments. But to get to the gender point, you're exactly right. You know, Princeton University has 50% women. Yale Law School has 50% women. Goldman Sachs' managing director ranks is maybe 10% women. I don't know the exact number. If that. Cravath's partner ranks is maybe 10 or 15% women, if that. So the women fall off a cliff having gotten an extremely elite education, and that seems like it's just economically irrational because they have all this training which renders them extremely productive, and yet they don't produce, except, as you say, they do produce
the next generation.
what they
Why
are.
is that happening, guys?
So here's my theory of it. In this meritocratic system, in which you need perfect practice, not just practice, the child's practice must be managed and directed by a super skilled worker. You cannot outsource elite child rearing to unskilled people. It needs to be someone who knows this game intimately. And in a gendered world, it is more likely to be the mother than the father. And so what meritocracy does is it makes the household a key unit of economic production. What it produces is the human capital of the next generation, and the attentive parent is a production worker in this system, producing the greatest asset that the rich people have. And in a gendered world, it's the mother. And that, I think, in significant measure, explains why women drop out of the workforce. Now, obviously, other things do too, like sexual harassment, sex discrimination. I mean, there are other shallower phenomena, economically shallower phenomena that keep women out of the elite workforce or have them leave. But this is an economically deep phenomenon connected to this form of economic production and reproduction. Does that seem plausible to you or not?
Yeah, it seems plausible to me. I mean, it reminds me of, I once saw a dissertation by a Marxist economist who was trained in Germany about how in developing countries the expansion of low-scale manufacturing, which was recruiting people out of the villages and out of their households into wage labor, was actually being subsidized by the fact that when someone went into wage labor, the burden of the care for older people, of the raising of children, of household work, of environmental degradation, all that could be tied to the fact that people were being drawn out of the household, so that when you made a calculation about how the wage payer, the factory owner, was exploiting the workforce, you had to take into account these knock-on effects from, it seems to me it's a similar point about the overlap between formal and informal sectors of human association, a wage labor sector on the one hand and the household sector on the other. And then there are cultural factors about how that cultural factors is what I'm saying. I'm not giving a full account of it, about how that division of household labor then gets gendered and why that's so. There's some people out there who are going to say men and women are different and that women are more oriented towards certain kinds of tasks and whatnot. I'm not necessarily saying that, but I'm noting that that argument is out there. Women making different life choices and that having an effect on the extent to which they're able to effectively compete within the workplace. I know I'm at Wellesley College, so I think I'll just stop there.
I'll maybe wrap up toward some audience questions. I wanted to end with being at Wellesley College. One of the things that in recent years
I got something else I want to say.
Okay. Now?
Well, I can say it now, yeah, because
Go ahead.
This insult thing made me think about honor. There is the insult. You're not as productive as me, and it's because you're no good. Okay, that's an insult. Okay, but there's also honor. I thought you were no good, and you turned out to be as productive as me. Wow. Okay, the underdog, thought to be a marginal person, uses the existence of meritocratic criteria of achievement to demonstrate their excellence. This becomes a way toward personal affirmation. I beat the man at his own game, so to speak. You take the game away from me, you level. I no longer have a way, my exceptional self, of demonstrating my exceptionalism because we're not giving A's anymore. We're giving everybody a C+.
So
I think that exceptionalism is one reason that meritocracy functions as an ideology that upholds hierarchy, though.
Yeah, well, everybody's not going to end up being exceptional. That's true. So it kind of rationalizes or justifies an inequality. On the other hand, I'm just saying, in that dark cloud is the silver lining of creating the possibility of somebody demonstrating their excellence according to objective criteria.
On this point, I think that this raises a deep moral and political tension or dilemma between the genuine, profound, and powerful appeal of certain kinds of liberal values, where by liberal I don't mean left, right, I mean liberal in the sense of Mill, Smith, and so on, and a deep, powerful, and enduring sense of critical values, where by critical I mean in particular Marx. Yeah. That is to say, it is of course true that structural leveling will involve curtailing not just individual liberties, but individual opportunities to shine, to accomplish, to assert self, to be, as you say, proud. And it's also true that the structures needed to recognize those opportunities will produce structural exclusion and subordination, which keeps a lot of people from realizing their potential. And I think one way to think about this is the proper role of political and economic organization and social policy to make a world in which ordinarily capable and ordinarily virtuous people can thrive in a modest way, or is it to allow extraordinary people to be extraordinary? And I say the either or because, of course, the answer is both, but on the margin there is a trade-off, and reasonable people can disagree about where to strike that trade-off.
I think that feeds nicely into what I wanted to ask, because we've talked a lot in recent years about inclusive excellence as a value that we're striving for at Wellesley College, and of course there's a lot to unpack in the terminology itself, what counts as inclusive and what counts as excellence. But I thought maybe a good ending question for our conversation would be to ask, as one of the institutions responsible for training the meritocratic elite, what is our responsibility as a college in addressing the discontents of meritocracy?
Well, to train people who otherwise might not have opportunities that we afford to our students here. Daniel has suggested that we might want to tax the endowments and kind of level the financial playing field. But don't we have an obligation to reach far and wide in our casting a net to try to attract people to our institutions, and then to take our work here in these places seriously about bringing on board people who have the native capacities to perform but haven't had the social experiences.
Can I riff off of inclusive excellence in answering?
Happy for you to.
So I want to draw a distinction between excellence and superiority. So here are two features of excellence. First of all, it's a threshold concept, not a rank concept. If you are more excellent than I am at something, I don't cease to be excellent on account of it. Once I get good enough at something, I'm excellent. And you can be better, and you're excellent too. And our excellence is not ranked vis-a-vis each other, and we're not competitors in excellence. Second of all, it's a substantive rather than a formal concept. To be excellent at something, the activity involved has to be worthwhile. It doesn't make sense to say, he is an excellent sadist, or she is an excellent swindler. Rather, to be excellent, you have to be excellent at something good. Now, superiority is different in both respects. Superiority is a rank, not a threshold concept. That is to say, as soon as you are superior to me, I am no longer superior. Doesn't matter how good I am. And superiority also has nothing, it's a formal rather than substantive concept. You can be a superior torturer, and you are genuinely superior. Now, why do I say this? Because meritocratic education and meritocratic production naturally drive our institutions to pursue superiority rather than excellence. To value our students and our workers based on who is slightly better than someone else at something, without regard to asking whether what they are good at is worthwhile. In the educational context, this shows up most clearly in the SAT and in college rankings. So here's a striking thing about US News and World Report rankings. I studied them recently because I wrote an essay on this. They construct their rankings out of a multi-factor index. Factors included in that index are number of books in the library, expenditure per student, total endowment, social mobility produced by the institution, faculty salaries, faculty scholarly reputation. Now, each of those things may be in one way or another worthwhile, but the idea that a metric that combines them by some formula is intelligible at all is obvious nonsense. It's not a question of whether it's unfair or distortionary. It's just nonsense. It's not intelligible to say Princeton has higher paid faculty, but Berea College does more for social mobility, and therefore, on average, Princeton is ranked 2 slots above Berea College. This is just nonsense. The same thing's true with the SAT. The idea that you would say of one student who is a profoundly original and vivid user of language, but can't do basic algebra, and another student who is a banal user of language and is okay at math, that they are both equally average students, is again literally unintelligible. But it's the quest for ranking, for superiority, that makes us turn to indices that are unintelligible as measures of excellence and disregard what we should be doing in colleges, which is figuring out what is worth doing by way of teaching and learning, and cultivating people who do it well, not who do it better.
Thank you. I'm mindful of time and also the tolerance people have for sitting and listening. And I want to just give our audience a chance to ask any questions that they may have.
Hi, thank you so much.
Just speak up so everyone can hear you.
Okay. I was wondering, because you brought up the SAT, if you could share your thoughts on their initiatives like the diversity score. I think they've struck that proposal. Is that helpful? Is the nature of the test in itself too problematic for that to be enough to provide meaningful context? I thought it was interesting what you had said about providing a metric for people to demonstrate exemplary achievement. How does that factor in, if at all?
Diversity score? Well, let me comment on what Dan said a moment ago. I'm not answering your question directly. I'm not sure how the desire to be able to feel proud about accomplishment factors into the larger social questions here, so I want to think about that. The index number problem is a problem. I mean, it's just inescapable. I've got a multi-dimensional object, and whether it's about ranking or evaluating, I mean, even if it's not in the service of hierarchical ranking, just in assessing the the effectiveness of some person as a student. I mean, I don't see any way around having to make some kind of relative weighting of that information. The question is what weights to put on the various multi-dimensions of the in this case, college. So I'm not sure what the operational implication of observing that it's apples and oranges. I agree that it's apples and oranges. That's the way it comes. It comes apples and oranges. We still have to make assessments.
So let me say something to that, and then I'll answer the question, or at least give you some thoughts about the question. I was a math major in college. One of my professors was a guy named Serge Lang, who some of you may know, who was a brilliant but troubled man. One thing he used to say is that to reject one extreme is not to affirm the opposite extreme. And so I completely agree with you. We can't get rid of trying to find some way to order multidimensional, multi-value problems where even when the values are incommensurable. But here's something we could do. If our education system were less hierarchical, if it weren't the case that all of our universities were ranked, let's say, we could have universities that specialize in different excellences. There could be universities that are extremely scholarly, but not practical. There could be universities that are practical in certain ways, really good at training people to do certain kinds of tasks, jobs. There could be universities that specialize in certain aesthetic values surrounding learning. There could be universities that specialize in social mobility. There could be universities that specialize in cultural snobbery. It's all possible. And the point is, if we didn't rank in this way, the universities, there wouldn't be as much pressure to come up with an all things considered metric of student accomplishment, because students could sort themselves based on which of the many excellences the universities pursued they found congenial. Now, of course, it might be that some excellences are more popular than others and the universities would have to choose, but the pressure would go way down. It wouldn't be eliminated, but it would go way down. From a world we're in now in which, for example, in law, because of the US News rankings and because Yale Law School is ranked #1, roughly 90% of the people we admit come. Everybody who has a choice prefers Yale over Harvard.
Which also feeds into your ranking,
Right.
right?
Which feeds into our ranking, which is bizarre because we're a pretty good law school, but Harvard's a pretty good law school too. And for that matter, the University of Alabama is a pretty good law school, and there are lots of people who have good reason to prefer going to the University of Alabama over Yale because it has a different set of excellences. But they can't afford to do that because everybody's ranked. So less hierarchy takes the pressure off. On the SAT, I guess I don't have a good answer. I have a narrative that's a cautionary tale that illustrates a little bit what's going on. So the SAT was invented and deployed initially in the service of equality of opportunity. The idea was that the old elite schools were not particularly academically good, but they had a stranglehold on places at elite universities. But it was very hard for schools outside of the elite to warrant that their graduates had learned things. And one way to correct for this was to give a test that could be available to everybody, where people could show that although they didn't go to the St. Paul's school, they nevertheless had a good education. And the SAT for a while functioned as a mechanism of opportunity. So James Tobin, Nobel Prize-winning economist, famously was an early Harvard student from a non-elite family in the Midwest who got there by being great at the SAT. Even in history, the SAT has very complicated histories. So I should disclose a journalist who is my brother-in-law recently was doing some work in the archives of the University of Texas, who discovered that in the 1960s, the administrators at the University of Texas very self-consciously and precisely manipulated the school's use of the SAT score in order to minimize the number of African Americans they had to admit. So it was a tool of racial exclusion in their hands.
What did they do?
They picked the threshold that, given the differential education in Texas high schools, would result in the smallest number of African American admittees. And there are memos in which they say, if we set this threshold, we'll have more. If we set this threshold, we'll have fewer, and we're going to pick the one that has the fewest. That was their goal. So that's a dark story. And the continuation, not quite right, the extension of that dark story to another dimension of hierarchy is that today the SAT is one of the most discriminatory, least egalitarian features of the college admissions package, precisely because it is one of the most teachable and most dependent on cultural capital. And so the thing that was, with good meritocratic motives, invented and adopted in the service of equality of opportunity, has become a pervasive block to equality of
Can
opportunity.
I ask Daniel a question? I know, so there's this big debate going on about exam schools in New York City and the use of tests. It's not the SAT, it's the PHSAT or something like that. And my understanding is that at these schools like Bronx High School of Science and Stuyvesant and whatnot, that the student body who are admitted based on this test consists disproportionately of non-white, disproportionately immigrant, disproportionately relatively low income households whose children are, many of them are Asian, are doing well on these tests. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah, so I have just one factual observation and then sort of a whale of upset. So the factual observation is that at the elite schools, the exam schools in the city, the kids are much more Asian. They are much less African American. They are also richer than at the rest of the New York City public school system.
They're richer.
They're richer than in the New York City public school system. They're not richer than the private school system.
Well, they're not rich.
No, they're not rich. They're not rich. They're not rich. They're just richer. They're not rich. They're just richer. And the reason why I emphasize this, and this leads into the whale, there's a line in a novel by Saul Bellow in which a character realizes, quote, he was in a wrong relation to the sum of things. And I think what this situation shows is that when you have massive economic subordination and hierarchy, massive race-based subordination and hierarchy, and some of the mechanisms that are in principle helpful at combating hierarchy have become the technologies of this form of subordination. There is no fully honorable way out. So these schools are genuinely engines of opportunity for some groups in the community who are not getting a fair shake. And they are genuinely obstacles to opportunity for other groups in the community who are not getting a fair shake. And in the choice between those two groups, it's impossible in an honorable or even decent way to say this group is more deserving than that group, or this value is greater than that value. And it's because the hierarchy is so pervasive and has so many structuring axes that you can't get out of it by fixing one. And that's the whale. There has to be another course. Now, I have views about what that course should be, but they're much more transformative, they're much more structural than deciding yay or nay about exam schools in Manhattan or New York City.
Another question?
Wait. I have two questions, but if you can hold it to one, it's totally all right. The first one is that a couple of weeks ago, I read an interview with Kevin Durant, the basketball player, and he recently launched a venture fund called 35 Ventures. And in the interview, he said that all these efforts are in pursuit of generating or creating generational wealth for his children. And generational wealth for his children. And he himself is from very humble backgrounds. He's now one of the star NBA players. And my first question is whether or not you two think that it's immoral or unethical to be in pursuit of that. My second question is that in understanding meritocracy not as equal opportunity, but in the way that the professor described it, I started to think of mass incarceration as the opposite of the accumulation of wealth in the top 1%, but that a lot of the efficiency of the top 1% in many industries relies on or hinges upon the mass incarceration of disproportionately Black people. And so I'm wondering if you could speak to the efficiency at the cost of the oppression of largely Black people.
Dylan, do you want to take that? That's kind
Well,
of
I'll be interested to hear what Daniel has to say about the sort of mirror image application of the argument on the negative side. So you've got social distinction, you've got wealth, you've got going to Princeton. On the other hand, you've got social, quote-unquote, dysfunction, failure. You've got incarceration, law-breaking, violence, and things like that. So that I'll be interested to hear. On Kevin Durant and generational wealth, I don't know what he's worth. He's in his probably, what is he, late 20s, early 30s. He's getting paid, I don't know what he's getting paid, 8 figures for sure on an annual basis. He wants to try to manage in such a way that kind of miraculous windfall for him in his life ends up benefiting his children. In the country that we live in, with so much wealth being passed on across generations within families, I'm hard-pressed to begrudge him that ambition. I suppose a progressive wealth tax at 2% a year applied assiduously over a period of time would render that to be a moot issue. But short of that kind of structural reform, why not allow a wealthy athlete of color or entertainer or somebody who writes novels for a living and sells 2 million copies a year pass on their good fortune to their children? If you're going to keep Kevin Durant from doing it, then there are a whole lot of other people in line ahead of him that I think you ought to apply the same strictures to.
Just to start there and then go to the question about mass incarceration. It's a structural feature of the argument of the Meritocracy Trap book that it's not a moralizing argument. In fact, I'm quite careful. At no point in the book at all do I use words like evil or selfish. I even think I never use the word justice, because I'm interested in structures. And people are, on average, morally average. And you want structures in which morally average people can behave well. And that may be a little bit of a feature of my sort of more or less Marxist view of economics and politics. But it's also a feature, and this goes to this project, I think. I'm generally inclined to think that we should conceive of morality as a set of precepts and norms that we use to guide our own conduct, not to evaluate other people's conduct. And so I'm just not inclined to have Kevin Durant wants to be a good father, and like everybody else. On the mass incarceration point, I'm a little skeptical about the causal claim you made that it's the mass incarceration that is a necessary condition for the accumulation of income and wealth at the top. We could talk about that. It's not that I think that nobody's getting rich off of it. I just think the scale is off to explain the great concentration of income and wealth at the top. But I think you've latched onto something really profound, and here's how I think about it. Under aristocratic inequality, so the old regime, elites despised industry. Work was a degraded activity, so much so that the labor movement, was a little bit an instance of claiming one's own degradation as a source of pride. And in that regime, the most subordinated group, namely African slaves, were condemned to forced labor as both the expression and the sign of their subordination. Today, industry is idolized by the elite. The Wall Street Journal has an advertisement that says people who don't have time make time to read the Wall Street Journal. Any member of the global elite who meets an acquaintance on the street and asks, "How are you?" knows that the correct answer is, "So busy." This is a world in which now that same hierarchy of subordination has an opposite expression, which is those at the bottom of the race-class hierarchy are condemned by mass incarceration to enforced idleness as the expression of their degradation, so that you get arrested, you get sent in prison, and you then become unemployed and unemployable. And that is the mirror image, in fact, in the social norms and imaginary of the meritocratic time, of the enforced labor that was imposed on the ancestors of this population by aristocratic inequality. So that's how I think about this in its social meanings, which is not to get to your causal question at all.
So I was thinking something a little bit different in response to the comment, and maybe I just didn't understand it. I was thinking not that incarceration is the necessary concomitant of wealth and success, but rather that the internal processes within the family that middle and upper middle class families are able to exploit in order to give their children an edge have their counterpart in quote unquote deficiencies within households. Parent is involved in the drug trade or is intermittently working in and out of prison or whatever, or the neighborhood is overrun with criminal activity, the kid is seduced or attracted into membership in a gang or has other peer influences that are deleterious. And the consequence is they then do something that's socially unproductive, like inflict a violent injury on their neighbor, and then they're being punished for it by the state, not in order to hold them idle for its own sake, but rather as a way, we can talk about what criminal justice should be, of holding people accountable for their quote-unquote wrongful and socially destructive actions. And the negative output of the socially destructive action, which is itself quote-unquote bred within family structure and private sphere, is a downside of the absence of a more socialized opportunity. Yeah. And if those kids, the kids grew up in housing projects, the kid who had a father in and out of prison and whatnot, who were surrounded by poverty, guns and violence and drugs, could get out of the inner city and into the sunlight of the countryside in the summertime, could have, more experiences that affirm and are nurturing to their human possibility, then we would have fewer people in prison, and we'd also have less misery from the depredations of criminal behavior within those communities. And that's a benefit available to society, not unlike the benefit of leveling the playing field in higher education. It's just operating in a different sphere of society.
And we don't even have to place the blame at the feet of individual families, because the neighborhood effects are huge because of the way that the concentration of wealth among the elites is not just a concentration of wealth, it's a geographic concentration. It's a hoarding of resources in particular geographic areas. And the flip side of that, the other side of the image, is having concentrated areas of neighborhood poverty where the community effects are huge and have to be weighed at least as heavily as the kind of individual family effects.
And one other point.
So excuse me, would meritocracy, would our antipathy or our doubt about the merits of meritocracy extend into the area of demeritocracy?
So I guess the most immediate response is, I don't have data on this, so this is now speculation. I am more inclined to attribute difficulties that children who grow up in poverty have, not to the presence of destructive parental behavior, but rather to the absence of a certain kind of exceptionally productive parental behavior. And one reason why I'm inclined to think that is that if we look at our achievement gaps, a striking thing about the situation we're in right now is that the biggest gaps by far are between the rich and the middle class. Mm-hmm. The gaps between the middle class and the poor are shrinking. They've been shrinking steadily for about 50 years in academic achievement. And they're now half to a third the gap between the rich and the middle class. And what that suggests to me is that the really big deal is not that poor and really disadvantaged parents somehow disserve their children. Maybe some do, maybe some don't. I don't know. A lot, neighborhood effects are powerful. I just don't know. But the really big deal is, what is it that these rich parents are doing that nobody else is doing?
One of the ways we see the neighborhood effects is that if you take a child who otherwise is poor or has the family form that we would associate with less time from parents, right? If they're in a rich neighborhood, their performance is much better because there are all kinds of community resources that they're able to get access to that they can't when they're in an area of concentrated poverty. I think maybe we should stop there in the interests of ending on time. And thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us. And I hope you'll stick around in case people have questions they weren't able to ask. Let's thank our guests.
Can I just say thank you? Thanks, man. Thank you. Real pleasure.